I knew the moment she stepped aside that no one in that room understood what they had just witnessed. It began, as most catastrophes do, with a choice that seemed reasonable at the time. Lord Garrett Prentice had called it a matter of legacy, of the kind of decision that separates men who lead from men who simply wish they did. And so he made his choice with the quiet efficiency of a man who had rehearsed it many times in private. He chose the alliance, the title, the land, the political future his advisors had mapped across 3 counties and 2 generations of strategic marriages. He did not choose Lady Serene Caldwell. She was standing near the far end of the drawing room when he announced it. Not at the center, where one might expect a woman to receive news of such weight, near the window. Still, as though she had known for some time that this particular morning would eventually arrive. He spoke at length. She did not move. When he finished, the silence that followed was not the silence of grief. It was not the silence of a woman searching for words, or swallowing tears, or calculating how to salvage what remained. It was something older than any of that, something that had been waiting, patient and entirely certain of itself, for exactly this moment. She turned, and what I saw in her face was not what anyone in that room had expected. She looked at him the way one looks at a sum that has finally, after long deliberation, resolved itself correctly, not with devastation, with recognition. She inclined her head, once precisely, in a gesture that functioned less like a farewell and more like the closing of an account. Then she set down her glass with the unhurried care of someone who intended to leave no trace of herself behind. And she stepped aside, not back, not away, aside, as though she were not leaving so much as removing herself from a path she had decided in that single moment she no longer wished to occupy. The room watched her go. No one spoke. There were perhaps 12 people in that room. By evening, there would not be a drawing room in London that had not heard some version of what happened, because no one knew what to say about a woman who had just been told she was not enough, and had responded as though the information were mildly interesting at best. Prentice stood exactly where she had left him, holding the expression of a man who had prepared for tears and received instead something he did not have the vocabulary to name. I had that vocabulary. I had spent enough years watching people navigate loss to recognize the difference between a woman who had been defeated and a woman who had simply reclassified someone. She was not defeated. She was done. And as I watched her disappear through the doorway with the calm of someone who already knew where she was going, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was not an ending. It was the first move. Everyone had an opinion about Lady Serene Caldwell. No one had any evidence. She was described variously as reserved, as quietly intelligent, as pleasantly unremarkable. The women who knew her socially found her polite and slightly difficult to read. The men who had attempted courtship found her gracious and entirely impossible to reach. Her family spoke of her with the particular brand of affection that contains, if one listens carefully, a faint note of bewilderment. She had never caused a scene. Demands in her world were a form of admission that something had been withheld, that someone had the power to withhold it. She never gave anyone that satisfaction. She had, for as long as anyone could remember, simply been present, composed, attentive, and somehow always positioned just slightly outside the center of whatever room she occupied. I had known her for 3 years before that morning, and in those 3 years I had collected, without fully realizing it, a series of moments that I was only now beginning to understand. I think of a dinner at Prentice's estate, nearly 2 years prior. He had been holding court at the head of the table, charming, confident, speaking at length about his plans for the northern properties. Expansion, reform. The kind of progress that sounds visionary when one does not examine it too closely. Serene had listened without expression. Then, at a pause in his performance, she asked, quietly, almost idly, whether his drainage surveys had accounted for the limestone shelf running beneath the eastern fields. Silence, not the polite kind, the kind that tightens the air. Prentice recovered quickly, laughed it off, changed the subject with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to managing rooms. But I had seen his jaw tighten. She had not been challenging him. That was the remarkable part. She had simply asked a question she already knew the answer to, and in doing so, revealed without a word of accusation that his grand vision was built on ground he had never bothered to examine. Then there was the library at Ashwick House. I had arrived early and found her alone, standing at the large table with a map spread open before her. Not a social map, not the kind of decorative geography that adorns drawing rooms. A surveyor's map, densely annotated. She was reading it the way a general reads a battlefield. She looked up when I entered, neither surprised nor embarrassed. She simply rolled the map, tucked it under her arm, and offered a perfectly pleasant remark about the weather. I said nothing, but I remembered it. And now, standing in the aftermath of Prentice's announcement, I found myself returning to those moments with new eyes. She had not been in love with Garrett Prentice. She had been watching him, measuring the distance between what he presented to the world and what he actually was. And at some point, I could not say exactly when, she had arrived at her conclusion. She had simply been waiting with extraordinary patience for him to confirm it. It began quietly, as all campaigns do. I noticed it before anything else. A man with nothing to hide does not require a campaign. A man who has simply made a difficult choice and moved forward does not need 3 weeks later to still be explaining it to anyone who will listen. But Prentice was explaining. At his club, at dinners, at the kind of intimate gatherings where the real engineering of gossip gets done, he was building something. Word by careful word, implication by considered implication. She had been difficult, he suggested, not in any way one could point to directly, nothing so crude as that, simply difficult. The kind of woman whose stillness read, if one were not careful, as warmth, whose composure could be mistaken, at a distance, for depth. He said it with great sadness, and that detail told me everything I needed to know. A man who has genuinely suffered does not perform his suffering with such consistent precision. He does not adjust the texture of his grief depending on who is seated closest to him. He does not deploy phrases like quietly unsuitable or fundamentally misaligned as though he had rehearsed them in a mirror until they sounded unrehearsed. Prentice was not grieving. He was constructing. I watched it happen across 3 separate occasions, and each time the architecture became more elaborate. By the 4th week, the story had acquired details it had not possessed at the beginning, a coldness of character, a certain opacity that had made genuine connection impossible. The sense, and he was always careful to frame it as a sense, nothing more, that she had never been entirely present, even when she was standing directly in front of you. It was almost impressive, if it had not been so transparent. Because the question no one thought to ask, the question that announced itself to me with increasing urgency as the weeks passed, was a simple one. Why? Garrett Prentice had ended an understanding. He had chosen a more advantageous alliance. These things happened. Society absorbed them with the practiced ease of an institution that had been metabolizing inconvenient truths for centuries. There was no reason to destroy her name in the process. Unless her name represented something he needed destroyed. I began quietly to pay attention in a different way. I watched who stiffened when her name was mentioned. I noted which conversations ended when I approached. I observed with particular interest the way Prentice's father, a man not given to unnecessary movement, crossed a room at Viscount Henley's reception to intercept a dialogue that had, from a distance, appeared entirely routine. Something was being protected, something that Seren Caldwell, in her unhurried departure from Prentice's drawing room, had either left behind deliberately or taken with her without anyone realizing it was gone. I did not yet know which, but I intended to find out before someone else did. I found it by accident. That is the part that stayed with me longest afterward. Not what the document contained, but the absolute ordinariness of how it came into my hands. No dramatic confrontation, no locked door forced open, no confession extracted under pressure. I had gone to retrieve a copy of my own family's land survey, a routine matter, the kind that requires an afternoon and produces nothing of interest, a solicitor's clerk, a misfiled envelope, a name on the outside that I recognized because I had been hearing it in carefully modulated tones of dismissal for the better part of a month. Lady Seren Caldwell. I should have set it aside. I did not. What I found inside was not a single document, but a collection of them. Thin pages, densely written, the kind of careful hand that belongs to someone who learned early that precision is its own form of protection. Letters, certificates, a legal attestation bearing 3 separate seals, the oldest of which dated to a reign that most people in current society knew only as history. I had to press the paper flat against the desk to stop my hands from moving. What I was reading did not rewrite Lady Serene Caldwell. It exposed her, not as a fraud, but as the most dangerous woman in London, wearing the costume of someone entirely forgettable. Lady Serene Caldwell was not who anyone believed her to be. She was not the unremarkable daughter of an undistinguished Western family. She was not the quietly unsuitable woman that Garrett Prentice had spent 4 weeks carefully constructing for public consumption. She was not the footnote his campaign had been methodically reducing her to. She was the sole living heir of the Caldwell-Vaughan line, a line the Crown had declared extinct 40 years prior, incorrectly, as it turned out, because the declaration had been based on documents that had themselves been falsified by parties with considerable interest in ensuring the line did not resurface. The restoration of that line, properly executed, would confer a title that predated half the peerage currently sitting in Parliament. It would make her, by any legitimate measure, one of the most powerful landowners in England. Not powerful for a woman, powerful. I set the papers down. Outside the window, London continued its afternoon with complete indifference to what had just rearranged itself inside my understanding. She had known. That was the detail I could not move past. She had known since she was 16 years old. I could see it in the earliest letter, written in a younger version of that same precise hand, addressed to a family solicitor, now long dead. She had known, and she had said nothing, and she had stood in drawing rooms and sat at dinner tables, and accepted the quiet condescension of people who believed themselves her superiors. And she had never once corrected them. Not because she couldn't. Because she had understood, with a clarity that now struck me as almost unbearable, that power announced too early is simply a target. And then Garrett Prentice had chosen his alliance, and she had stepped aside. And somewhere between that morning and this one, she had simply stopped hiding. I sat with that for a long time. Then I reached for my coat. I did not go to her immediately. That was the first decision, and perhaps the most important one. Because a man who arrives at a woman's door 3 hours after reading documents he was never meant to see is not an ally. He is a complication. And Serene Caldwell had spent the better part of her life managing complications with a patience I was only beginning to appreciate. She did not need my urgency. She needed my precision. So I went to work. The first visit was to Lord Aldrich Pembury, the oldest sitting member of the College of Heralds, the one man in England whose opinion on matters of lineage carried the weight of a royal decree. I presented him with nothing, no documents, no names, no indication of why I was asking, only a question, framed as idle historical curiosity, about the Caldwell-Vaughan attainder of 1804. He answered without hesitation, and in his answer, specifically in the 3 details he included that I had not asked for, I understood that the falsification had been known in certain quiet circles for decades, known and left undisturbed because the parties with interest in its continuation had been until recently too powerful to challenge. Until recently. The second visit was to Lady Constance Whitmore, whose drawing room functioned for all practical purposes as the appellate court of London society. I did not ask her for anything. I simply introduced, at the correct moment, in an otherwise unremarkable conversation, the observation that the Caldwell family's Western holdings were considerably more historically significant than their current standing suggested. I watched her eyes. She filed it, precisely where I had intended. The third move was the surgical one, a letter, not sent, but placed, left on the reading table in the anteroom of the Lord Advocate's private chambers during a reception at which I knew he would eventually sit alone. It contained no accusations, no demands, only a series of dates, names, and property references that, assembled in the correct order, described the outline of a 40-year fraud with the detached clarity of a mathematical proof. I did not sign it. I did not need to. What I needed was for the machinery of consequence to begin turning before Prentice realized it was in motion. A man who believes he has already won does not watch his flanks. He watches the person he has defeated, waiting for the grief, the desperation, the inevitable attempt at reclamation that he has already prepared his response to. He was watching for Seren to move. He was not watching me. By the end of the second week, 3 separate conversations about the Caldwell-Vaughan line had occurred in rooms where Prentice's allies were present. None of them had been traced back to me. All of them had planted the same seed, quietly, in different soil, in the particular way that ensures a thing grows without anyone being certain who placed it there. The stage was almost ready. There was only one thing left to do. I went to find her. She was not surprised to see me. That was the first thing. I had traveled 2 counties, arrived unannounced at a house that appeared, from the outside, entirely unprepared for visitors. And Lady Seren Caldwell opened the door to her late father's study, looked at me across a desk covered in maps and correspondence, and said nothing for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to confirm that she had been expecting someone to come. She had simply not known it would be me. "You read the documents," she said. It was not a question. "I did," I replied. She considered that. Then she gestured to the chair across from her with the unhurried economy of a woman who had more important things to do than perform surprise. We spoke for 2 hours. She told me what she intended. Not as a confession, as a briefing. Clean, sequenced, without a single word wasted on the emotional architecture of what Prentice had done to her. She was not going to embarrass Garrett Prentice. She was going to make embarrassment impossible. The venue was the Sovereign's Autumn Assembly, the largest gathering of the season, attended by every significant family in 3 counties, presided over by the Lord Advocate himself, who had, by that morning, already read an unsigned letter and spent a sleepless week thinking about it. She arrived without announcement. Not in mourning colors, not in the muted tones of a woman reclaiming respectability by degrees. She wore the deep blue of a house that had not yet been seen in public in 40 years, a color so specific in its heraldic reference that Lord Pembury, standing near the entrance, went entirely still when he saw it. He knew exactly what it meant. Within minutes, so did everyone else. She walked directly to where the Lord Advocate stood with Prentice's father, and she placed before them, without theatre, without elevation of voice, without a single gesture that could be described as anything other than administrative, a set of documents that had been authenticated by 3 independent parties over the preceding fortnight. Prentice's father read the first page. His color left him in stages. Garrett Prentice, standing 6 feet away, understood what was happening approximately 4 seconds before the Lord Advocate turned to look at him with an expression that required no interpretation. The room had gone completely still, every eye on her, and then Seren turned, for the first time that evening, and looked directly at Garrett Prentice. Not with anger, not with triumph, with the same expression she had worn the morning she stepped aside, the expression of a sum that had finally resolved. She spoke quietly enough that only those closest heard it, but in a room that silent, that was everyone. "You chose power over love," she said. "I simply waited for you to hand me both." Prentice said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The fall was total, not loud. That was the detail people would discuss for years afterward. How quiet it had been. No dramatic accusation. No public confrontation staged for maximum effect. Simply a woman placing documents on a table with the calm efficiency of someone completing a task she had begun a long time ago. The Lord Advocate acted within the week. The Caldwell-Vaughan restoration was formally recognized before the month was out. The fraud, 40 years of it, carefully maintained across 3 families and 2 generations of deliberate silence, collapsed like a house of rotten cards, the kind that only stood because everyone had agreed, for 40 years, not to breathe too hard in its direction. Prentice's alliance collapsed the same afternoon his father's involvement became a matter of record. The family withdrew from London with the kind of haste that answers every question it is trying to avoid. Lady Seraphina Holt, the woman he had chosen, the alliance he had traded everything for, dissolved the understanding within a fortnight, her father's letter of termination notable for its brevity and its complete absence of regret. He had chosen power over love. He had lost both. I saw Seren once more before the season ended. She was overseeing the formal survey of the restored Caldwell-Vaughan estates, standing in an open field with a surveyor's map under her arm, speaking with the unhurried authority of a woman entirely at home in the full dimensions of what she had always been. She looked up when I approached. "You built the stage," she said. "You wrote the performance," I replied. She almost smiled. It was, I had come to understand, her version of warmth, that precise fractional softening that most people missed entirely because they were looking for something louder. I thought about everything I had not understood for the 3 years I had known her. Every moment I had filed as unremarkable, every silence I had misread as absence. She had not been invisible, she had been waiting for the world to become worth being seen in. I rode home that evening with the particular feeling of a man who has witnessed something he will spend the rest of his life measuring other things against. Garrett Prentice had looked at Lady Seren Caldwell and seen a woman he could afford to leave. I had read 4 pages of a misfiled document and understood, with a clarity from which there was no return, that he had not abandoned a woman. He had abandoned the most powerful person in the room, and never even known it.